sorry, thank you, Nakia, for starting the recording. And I apologize for pausing there, but that took over my screen. So yes, Deirdre has extensive experience working with families and children with speech and language disorders and challenging behaviors in homes, clinics, and school settings. She's dually certified and licensed as a board-certified behavior analyst at the doctoral level and a speech-language pathologist with her certificate of clinical competence through ASHA. Deirdre's research interests center on understanding and implementation of evidence-based behavioral practices in the areas of behavior management and speech-language pathology. She has published qualitative and quantitative research in the areas of feeding disorders and communication deficits in ASD, as well as developmental disability. Recent publications are in receptive language intervention in children with ASD and/or developmental disability and are directly related to the topic we're discussing tonight. In addition to working at the Center for Autism, Deirdre also serves as the SLP for a multidisciplinary team at Albany Medical Center Hospital, where she completes multidisciplinary assessment of communication and feeding difficulties. I'm also going to just add briefly, she's got great information to share tonight. If anybody is interested in receiving a copy of the slides, I'm going to be putting my email address into the chat, and you're welcome to send me an email letting me know you'd like a copy of those, and I'll send them over to you. Thank you. And Deirdre, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much for all of that. Wonderful information. Makes me sound very important. Yes, my topic is stimulus equivalence and language intervention. And I have recently started doing some investigation into receptive language disorders, particularly in children who have significant and severe language disorders. And that is sort of what has renewed my interest in stimulus equivalence and relational frame. And so I'm hopefully going to tie those two things together very much in an overview. So if this is something that you are very familiar with, this is really sort of the basics of both and how they are connected. That's sort of what I'm up to this evening. So if you have, I'm not sure actually, Sophie, what's the question situation? Do I wait till the end to answer questions or during? What are we doing?
I think we can go with whatever your preference is.
Okay.
If you have one. I think we often do at the end, but if you prefer them throughout, that's fine too.
Yeah, the end is fine. Let me trundle through, and then at the end, hopefully if you have questions, I can answer them then. Okay, so let's get started. I really don't have any disclosures, but who doesn't love a great Irishman? So I couldn't resist putting Oscar Wilde up here. So I really don't have any declarations. The only thing that I do have to disclose is that I am helping SPABA with the grant cycle for the 2024 awards. So hold on, not working. So I guess what I'd like to do is sort of start with an overview of where all of this comes from, right? So the question is, what is being human that seems unanswerable with straightforward consideration of behavioral repertoires, right? So what is it about being human that sets us apart? That's the question. And I think it's fundamental to our understanding of ourselves as who we are as human beings. And something that I think behavior analysts and cognitive scientists have really tried to answer for quite some time now. And so I just picked 3 random ones that I thought of, but love is an answer to that question, right? It's not something that's answerable with a straightforward behavioral repertoire. Telling stories or telling tales is not really answerable with a straightforward consideration of behavioral repertoires. And of course, jokes aren't really answerable either, right? So my joke about Oscar Wilde, I don't know if you thought it was funny or not, but I told it anyway. And so I don't know, I'm not necessarily being reinforced for being flippant about, Oscar Wilde, but it's just an important example of what we need to consider as we're thinking about how we can manipulate language, I suppose, as behavior analysts and speech language pathologists. So the question is, how do we learn? And so we all understand the basic principles of reinforcement, punishment, all that stuff. So we have a behavioral repertoire that's either reinforced or punished, right? So you go back to behaviors that are reinforcing and you decrease the behaviors that are punishing. So our behaviors really are a culmination of what is strengthened, or what I affectionately call our baggage. Right. So everyone comes to the situation with the baggage. And so we really are that baggage, for want of a better way to explain it. But what's really tricky for us, I think, at this point in the explanation to understand is how teaching some skills requires lots of small tasks and lots of teaching. So think about things like learning to write or learning to tie your shoes. Those, I would often say to the students at St. Rose, which is closing, and so hence I have a new job, that you don't come out of the womb knowing how to write. So how did you get there? What is it about that complex skill that now comes automatically to you? So we all have these repertoires, right? So consider the repertoire of an adult who can tie his shoes, he can tie his tie, and he can tie a boat to a trailer, right? So consider that learning repertoire and the arc of that learning repertoire, and compare that to a child who might not yet be able to tie his shoes. So that's the comparison that I'm making. And then what I really want you to think about is, how does that work in terms of verbal behaviors? So how does that work in terms of idioms, metaphors, similes, clauses, jokes, the language of entertainment, right? Telling tales, stories, engaging conversation, the language of refusal, tall tales, right? Or oratory. How does that work, right? Where do those repertoires come from? And I think we can probably, as behavior analysts or behavior-minded speech language pathologists, we can probably think, well, I know how he learned to tie his shoes. I know how he learned to tie his tie, right? But I'm not 100% sure how he learned to use idioms so effectively. And I think that's the beauty of stimulus equivalence and relational frame. It sort of gives you that sense of, how did that happen? How did we get here? So stimulus equivalence is essentially the 1971 study that you probably all have heard of by Murray Sidman. And it was the first published study on the emergence of behaviors that hadn't been directly reinforced. And so the participant in that original study was an older person, like an adult with severe intellectual disability, but he was able to identify novel relationships between pictures and words without being taught the relationships between those two things. And this was sort of groundbreaking back in the 1970s. Nobody had ever really said, well, we can look at these behaviors and just watch the emergence of a new behavior. That wasn't something that really was on the radar for behavior analysts at the time. So stimulus equivalence is essentially that. It's the emergence of untrained responses following reinforcement of trained responses, right? So it happens after the learner identifies a relationship between two or more non-identical stimuli, but they haven't been trained on that relationship. So the derived relations are the same in some way as the original stimulus. So, and when I say the same, I mean loosely the same. I don't mean identical for the purposes of stimulus equivalence. There are a couple of good background publications. that you should know about. There's Rayfeld, the 2011 study that is a review of stimulus relation studies that were published in JABA from 1992 to 2009. There were only 27 articles published in that time frame, and the majority of them were about words, so text and reading. Another interesting background publication is this one by McLay and all of her colleagues, and it is a review of the formation of stimulus classes in autism. And the evidence in the literature is that only some of the individuals learn the untaught relations. And of course, this to me is right. I'm like, why? What's up with that? Why are only some of the children doing this? Why aren't all of the children doing this? So you'll see how that's relevant to what I'm going to talk about a little later on. The children with developmental disability did not appear to show emergence of untaught relations. And ultimately, across all of the articles that she reviewed, her conclusion was that the findings were variable. Like 50% of the participants showed emergence of the untaught relations, which isn't much, obviously, and it's as good as a flip of the coin, which isn't really good enough when you're talking about trying to teach kids. So the elements of stimulus equivalence are these three things that you see on the screen right now. So reflexivity, symmetry, and transitivity are essentially what makes up stimulus equivalence. Reflexivity is, as you see right there, A equals A. So car equals car, right? They're the same, identical objects, so to speak. Symmetry will be A equals B, and then we get a derived relation from teaching somebody A equals B that we're going to assume that they will learn that B also equals A, right? And then the third one is what's called transitivity, where A equals B, we have B equals C, and the derived relationship would be A is C, right? So it means the sameness of an object or a word or a picture, right? So in some way, those three things are the same, if you like. And in this case, the example I was using was car. But clearly over here in my little picture, you can see the functional equivalent class for stop, right? We have the stop sign, we have the stop hand, and we have a stop light, right? And so we create a functional class for stop by using three different things that we all know are equivalent if we see them in the environment. So symmetry would look like this. So my dog has disappeared because there's too many people on my screen. So I'm just going to minimize this if you bear with me for a second. Okay, so this is what symmetry would look like. So we would have the word dog, if you like, and we have a dog in the environment. And so we will train somebody that the word dog is this animal that you see on the screen right now. And we will assume that if that person sees the dog, that then they will be able to say dog, right? That's the heart of symmetry. And that becomes, that green arrow is what we call the derived relation, right? We train somebody that dog equals dog. So hourly dog equals object dog. And then we assume that at some level, they're going to be able to say, oh, dog. And of course, in children who are typically developing, that's exactly what happens. And in children who are typically developing, we call that, you may have heard the term fast mapping. And that's essentially what we call that development in kids who are typically developing, that ability to really quickly absorb that sort of information and then be able to say when they see a dog that it's a dog, or when they see a cat, they're able to differentiate the dog from the cat, right? So another example for symmetry is this. So you hear the word dog, and you see the text dog, and you train somebody to equate dog, the word dog, with the text dog, right? And then we're going to assume that the untrained or derived relation is they will see the word dog, the text dog, and they will be able to say, oh, that says dog, right? So that is also symmetry, that ability to, that what really is a bidirectional way of identifying sameness between those two stimuli, right? So there is a sameness between them, but they're not identical. So at this point, what we have is we have taught the child to hear the word and be able to match it to a picture, and then to hear a word and be able to match it to text. So that's what we've got so far, which isn't bad, right? So we've done our due diligence. The kids are at this point, and we're sort of congratulating ourselves that we've got them this far. But in typical development, what we will see is this concept of transitivity. So we hear dog, we see the dog, and we see the trained relation. We then see, right, that bidirectional stimulus equivalence doesn't disappear. And then remember, we've also trained dog text to the word dog, right? That was the trained relation, and bidirectional doesn't disappear. And so then what happens? We have the emergence of an untrained relation that in typical kids, right, typically developing children will be able to look at the dog, look at the word and say, that says dog, that's a dog, and I'm saying dog, right? And that's the essence of transitivity. And that's the essence of stimulus equivalence. That ability to be able to see the sameness between those three stimuli, even though they're not the same. Sounds kind of ridiculous, but I hope you're all still with me and I haven't lost you all. Okay, so having trained those two relations, if the child can manage transitivity, now what we have is we have hear word match to picture. We have hear word match to text. We have hear the word, say the word. We have see the picture, say the word. We have see text, say the word. We have see text match the item. We have see picture or object and match the object. And of course, we have see the picture and match it to text. So we really have increased the bang for our buck, so to speak, when we see that concept of transitivity emerge in children who are learning to talk. Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to just introduce was this idea of what you've probably heard of if you're interested in this topic at all, called arbitrarily applicable relational responding. And so stimulus equivalence falls under this umbrella of arbitrarily, AARR, let's go with that because it's much easier to say. And so AARR is learning to treat the names and objects as the same, even though they are physically different. All right, so we have this broader umbrella that sort of helps us to conceptualize stimulus equivalence. And as it happens, the next topic that I'm going to introduce, relational frame. And so remember, we have A equals B, B equals A, where B equals A is the derived relation and is key to linguistic reference of an object, right? And so it's important because there is an argument in several of the researcher camps that children who cannot acquire symmetry will not be able to name, right? So there is that argument that if a child doesn't have that bidirectional ability between name and object, object back to name, that then their ability for generative language decreases exponentially. So it's also referred to as naming, and it leads us to relational frame theory. So at this point, having done Murray Sidman in the 1970s, we're sort of moving now into the 1980s, as a way to try and continue to understand how does this whole thing explain language development. So under relational frame, if you're thinking about the stimulus equivalence idea and how it works, I'm sure you're all familiar with intraverbals, tacks, and mans. Everybody who, is a speech therapist and a behavior analyst is familiar with those, and many behavior analysts obviously very familiar with those. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying, which is that there are lots of children who lack the ability to generate language independently or to create a sentence that nobody has ever heard before, right? There's lots of those kids. They're the kids that, keep us in jobs, honestly. So typically developing children learn to generate language over time and through interactions, but obviously kids with developmental disability, language impairment, and ASD do not. So we need a better way, like I said at the top of the presentation, like stimulus equivalence goes some way to helping us understand how language develops, but it doesn't go it doesn't help us understand how idioms emerge, or it doesn't help us understand similes or metaphors, right? So we need a better way to explain it. There's way more required for language learning than symmetry and transitivity, right? In order to be able to understand and generate language. So in relational frame theory, or in otherwise known as relational framing, so we have this same idea. We have this idea of these trained relations, and the theory gets its name from this idea that each one of these things is a frame, right? So the word dog is a frame. The dog itself is a frame, right? The written dog is a frame. And so the idea is that regardless of what's in the frame, it's about the responding, right? So it's about how you respond to what's in the frame that's important. And so you get a broader sense of how the language emerges. So in relational frame, like I said, it relates to the pattern of responding, regardless of what is in the frame. So as long as the child learns the name, object, text, sameness, and we can bring this under contextual control, like you see in the picture, right? Then we can say that the child has learned, right? Or the essence of language has emerged in some way. And this helps us. It sounds like stimulus equivalence. You're all saying, what's she talking about? This is just what she explained through stimulus equivalence. But the biggest difference between stimulus equivalence and this idea of a relational frame theory is that the relational, the relational frame is not only sameness, right? So in relational frame theory, we can also explain the language of distinction or the language of comparison, right? We can explain, if you delve into the literature around stimulus equivalence and relational frame, you'll see experimental language studies around less and more, for example, or you will see experimental studies around opposition. And so relational frame gets at more than just the equivalence of objects and pictures and text. And so we can think about conceptual ideas of larger and smaller, or above and below, or on and off, or empty and full, right? So we can start to think about, well, how do I frame that, right? And in order to help you frame that, take this example of the coffee, right? So the cup is empty. If I tell you the cup is empty, what are you deriving from that information? Hopefully you're deriving that the cup is not full, right? So if I tell you it's empty, you automatically know that the cup is not full. It's just how it works, right? And in relational frame, the idea is that regardless of what's in the frame, we can generate understanding of the language that we've heard. So alternatively, you might say he's filling the cup. So what's derived from he's filling the cup? What's derived from he's filling the cup is that the cup is not empty. All right. So we can assume or derive these other ideas of oppositionality or of, like I said, distinction, comparison, analogy, temporality. We can come up with those derived relations because what was in the frame for us was an empty cup or the statement he is filling the cup. I hope that makes sense to everybody. Should I stop right here and just ask if anybody has any questions? I didn't even look at the chat to see if there were questions in the chat.
We don't have any questions in the chat so far.
Okay, so I should keep going. Okay. Okay, so the ability for us to generate language within a frame without the need to have explicitly talked about it or labeled it is the basis of relational framing, right? This idea that I just used, the example I just used with the coffee and the cup, that's the whole basis of relational framing. And just to put on your radar that there is a lot of well-established, well-researched phenomena for both adults and children that really explains it probably better than I'm doing right now. But, you know, you can really honestly get into some of the details of relational framing and you go down a rabbit hole and honestly, the language is sometimes quite difficult to understand. It's, you know, there are derived relations within relational frame. And actually I wrote them down because I knew I wouldn't remember them. And they are derived relations of what are called mutual entailment, which is the same thing basically as symmetry. Then there's combinatorial entailment, which is transitivity. And then importantly, I think for explaining this concept, there is this idea of transformation of stimulus function in relational frame. And the idea there is that if you're afraid of dogs and somebody says to you, Madra means dog. So Madra being the Gaelic word for dog. So you're afraid of dogs. And I say to you, Madra means dogs. Now we have sameness. And you hear, here comes Madra. What is your reaction likely to be, right? That's the contextual fit of relational frame. That's sort of the basis of what's going on. Now, I know I've used sameness again as an example, but that's essentially, that's the relational frame. I don't know how better to explain it. So just one more thing that I want to mention before I get into the applied part of the evening. And that's this idea of verbal cusps. And you probably are familiar with these already, but the verbal cusp is the onset of a behavior that allows the learner to come into contact with contingencies that they wouldn't normally have accessed prior to being on the cusp, right? So, and the example I use for this one is think about the world that opens up when you learn to drive, right? So it just sort of changes everything. The contingencies of reinforcement that you can engage in once you learn to drive sort of seem endless, right? When you finally get behind the wheel. So it's important for me to mention this now because it's relevant to the applied study that I want to talk about next. Cusps can significantly increase the rate of learning. And so we know that if we can get children to these cusps of learning, that they will then learn other stuff more quickly as they go. And this sort of leaves us with the question, leaves me particularly with the question, excuse me, is there a road to generative language learning in children with significant delay? Excuse me, I need a drink. because if we can get children to these verbal cusps, can we then sort of push them over the cusp and get them to the next step and accelerate the learning that we would like them to have? And so I'm going to talk about the study that we just completed, and hopefully this will come more into the frame for you when I talk about the study. So, but first, I want to go back to the Maclay articles because they are important in the context of what I'm talking about. So I mentioned the 2013 one already, and that is a review of the formation of stimulus classes in autism spectrum disorder. And like I said, those authors mentioned basically at the end of their study, their conclusion appeared to be that findings were variable, that they couldn't see any consistency in learning for kids with ASD. I should mention that one of the things that did seem to predict whether or not kids could learn symmetry and transitivity was the amount of language that the child had before engaging in the experiment, if you like. So the more language they had, the more likely it was that they would learn symmetry and transitivity, which entirely makes sense, right? The other one I want to point out is this 2016 article. And again, you can see that there's variability. She had 10 participants and only 5 of the 10 children with autism showed emergence of all untaught relations. Again, sort of the flip of a coin. Their study was about numbers, right? So they were doing stimulus equivalence across numbers. And again, all of the children who showed emergence of relations had some language prior to engaging in this number experiment. And the children had 2 to 4 word utterances or better. And so once again, I think the same authors for sure, but I mean, there really are sort of confirming what they had already said 3 years prior, that there's variability in the findings for this, particularly for children who are minimally verbal. Okay, so the applied study that we did. So it was stimulus equivalence in a preschool, and it was a multiple baseline across 3 participants. We have since replicated this across 2 more participants, and that one is has been revised and resubmitted. And then we're now engaged in a 3rd one, which I will mention in a little bit. The research questions were, does teaching receptive vocabulary to preschoolers with receptive language impairment generalize to matching objects to non-identical pictures? Does a match to sample procedure result in independent receptive identification of objects in the absence of the pictures? In other words, return to baseline. And more recently, does match to sample and receptive labeling allow for the emergence of the expressive label, so symmetry, in other words, without direct teaching or training? That was sort of where we started. Now, just a quick primer for you on match to sample in case you've forgotten what it is. It is basically the procedure where the participant is presented with an object and is asked, or a picture, and is asked to match that to a sample of some sort. And there's 2 articles in particular that we based our study on. One of them was Gros and LeBlanc, and the other one was Lamarca and Lamarca, if you're familiar with those 2 receptive language studies. And they actually recommend an array of 2, but in our study, we used an array of 3, and it didn't seem to make any difference to the kids' learning, right? So if the participant identifies the word correctly, reinforcement is offered. There's no direct teaching, and so the participant is taught to be trained rather than directly taught, right? So here we have what we did for reflexivity, car. And the child had to find the object, car, at baseline, and that was just simple reflexivity, right? Here, car, pick the car. There was an array of 3, all right? And so once we got into it, what we did was we had the child match the object to the identical picture. And then the untrained relation was, well, can they match the object to a non-identical picture? It's still reflexivity, but it's a little more difficult. And my question was, well, is this a verbal cusp? Does this constitute this amazing thing that accelerates learning if the child gets it, right? So in symmetry, what we would be expecting is this. Car. Contextually, the child is playing with the car and the child says car, not with an Irish accent, obviously, but still. And so that would then be symmetry, right? So then we would say, oh my gosh, look at that, we have trained them to match the car to the word car, and now they're saying car when playing with the car, right? That's the emergence of symmetry. And so it's at this point that the literature is telling us that children who are significantly language impaired, they can't do this. They cannot necessarily do what the example that I've just provided, right? That labeling of the object, having been trained on the object. This is just sort of a capturing in words of what I just explained. I just want to check the time. So I'm just going to drop this here and leave it for anybody who wants it if you request the PDFs. Okay, so the participants for our studies, for the first study was 3 preschoolers diagnosed with ASD with significant expressive and receptive language delay. And they were recruited through a local preschool. And I really am interested in the language of what Taggart, Flischberg, and Casari have labeled the neglected end of the spectrum, right? Those kids who are very impaired language-wise, very impaired cognitively. They've always been my favorites, and nothing has changed over the years. They're still my favorites. So I was collaborating with an SLP who was working in a local preschool, and that's how we managed to recruit these kids. So the multiple baseline that we engaged in, we used pictures and objects. We did match to sample. We had a physical prompt hierarchy, and of course we had positive reinforcement for when they matched as we wanted them to. Generalization was completed by introducing the non-identical pictures, and maintenance was conducted after mastery of vocabulary sets 2, 3, and 4, but not after 1, because we would just be essentially testing a few words after 1. So we had double the amount at 2, we had triple the amount at 3, and we had quadruple at 4. So these are the words that we used. And once again, I went back to the literature to try and find literature that would help me understand, well, what are the first words that children learn? And so for the most part, these were identified by Fernald and her colleagues as the first words that children learn. And so we did add some and we took some out. This study was done during COVID. And so we didn't have banana and cookie and milk because that just seemed completely gross. So we took those out and we put in things that we were able to handle or clean, just to keep us all sane. So we had 3 kids. We had Andrew, who knew cat, keys, and fork at baseline, and Anne, who knew none of them at baseline, and Nicole, who knew cat at baseline. All right. So this is what they look like. So we had an object of a puzzle, and that's what it looked like. So there was that picture and there was that puzzle. We had a non-identical picture like that, but we had 3 of them so that we could rotate them. We had that cat. I actually went to a local toy store and had to buy a bunch of cats because I couldn't buy just one. So we had that cat, and then we have this non-identical cat. And then we had pencil is easy, right? And we had non-identical pencil case. And so these were the ones that we used for match to sample. And these were the ones that we used for the generalization, what we call generalization. But I think, you know, having done it and understanding it better, the more I do it, I think it's probably not generalization as much as this is this verbal cusp that I'm thinking about. So the additional considerations, mastery was 80% over 3 sessions. Differential reinforcement for correct responses was individualized based on the child. And then data was collected on every response and on all prompt levels. And so what that looked like was they were given a set of words. So we had the words laid out. We had a little key that helped us to know what the prompt level was. And so I is independent, FP is full physical, and PP that you see over here is partial physical. And those were all operationally defined in the prompt hierarchy before the onset of the study. And then these red cells that you see here are the inter-rater reliability. So they were highlighting the difference between this rater and the other rater on that, whatever that day was. So our results look like this. And so what you're seeing here is that all of the children learned to receptively identify the target words, right? They all got it. I don't know why my circle here is above my dots, but you get the idea, right? And so all of them were able to generalize with varying degrees of success to the non-identical pictures. I'm disappointed that it's, so these arrows should be pointing at the little open, right? Because that's generalization. And then, oh, I don't know what happened there. All of the children maintained the receptive vocabulary at 1 month follow-up, right? So you can see that there and you can see that there, and I can't see the other one because I see all your faces. And all of the children attempted to name the objects. Now, and that was a phenomenal thing, particularly for this little person here, who, as you can see, took a very long time to get it right. And in fairness to the SLP that I was collaborating with, she was the one who said, no, we're going to keep going. We're going to keep doing it. She's going to get it. I'm going to keep going. We're going. And of course, she did eventually get it, but look how long it took. So other things that are important to point out, that the learner profiles are very important, I feel like, and that was our main argument in the publication. Andrew and Nicole learned significantly faster than Anne. So what you're seeing here is Andrew, Anne, and Nicole, right? And this dotted line here represents set 1 for Anne, right? That's how much longer it took her to get here than it took the other 2. So here's, I forget which, so this point here is Andrew, and the gray line right here is Nicole, right? Nicole was the fastest of them all, but she also was the one with the most interfering behaviors. However, with persistence, Anne also learned to identify all of the vocabulary, so dosage and persistence really mattered. Anne's learner profile, she needed lots of additional exposure and prompting to master the task. Ultimately, she was able to transfer that learning to other pictures and of objects, and she consistently, what we call, named some of the objects, but they were really only word approximations. So she was able to say sh for shoe, and we had this crazy bird that she liked, and she would do b for bird. They did not constitute words as such. They really were word approximations. In addition, stimulus equivalence, this was our conclusion. Match to sample really does hold promise for teaching children with significant receptive language impairment. And I'm not the only person who has come to that conclusion. There are some researchers in, I think they're in Norway, not 100% sure. They came to the same conclusion, and I do use their article in the introduction to mine, because they essentially arrived at the same conclusion that Match the Sample does hold promise to teach these children who have significant receptive language impairment. It also appears that young children with receptive language impairment can learn symmetry with persistence, but a huge caveat here. Our vocabulary was functional. If you look at the stimulus equivalence literature, you will see coins and you'll see car emblems and you will see stimulus, I forget what they called them, but they were like squiggles. They were almost like what a child would draw to represent a cloud. And so they would make up names and they would make up these little squiggles and have the children match the new names to the squiggles. And I feel like particularly for the kids with receptive language impairment, that the keeping the vocabulary functional was really essential in our success. The children who are significantly language impaired may be showing emergence of verbal cusps, and this is a huge research question for me as I push ahead with the next studies that we're doing. And then the cusps may be contributing to the spontaneous naming that emerged for all of the children in the study. Like the little guy, Andrew, in the study was able to learn to name pretty much everything by the end of the study. Now, there were only 20 some odd words, but he had most of them by the time we were done. And we didn't teach him those. They emerged, they were derived, and he got it. And he also started labeling his reinforcers, which was really nice. Lots of limitations, of course. Social validity was a significant limitation because it was during COVID. Learner profiles. Learner profiles that differed considerably and had me at the point where I was ready to just throw my hat in the ring and say, forget about Anne, let's just run with 2. The small number of vocabulary words. Oops, sorry. What did I do? The limited demographic of the students that we had, and the biggest mistake I think that we made, we didn't formally track the emergence of the labels. So here we are now at study 3. Study 2, as I mentioned, has been revised and resubmitted. And at study 3, we have resolved the limited vocabulary issue. I got a couple of small professional development grants and bought hundreds of objects. So now we're able to work with hundreds rather than tens of. We have included social validity for the preschool teachers for this new set of kids that we're working with. And we are tracking expressive labels at this point. We're trying to catch everything so that we can make a better argument. So my remaining research questions are, is it really true that children with ASD cannot learn stimulus equivalence or stimulus relations? Or with perseverance, can children with significant language and cognitive impairment learn symmetry and transitivity? I don't know. Nobody has ever stuck with it for long enough that they have been able to answer that question. Or can the verbal cusps contribute to the emergence of stimulus equivalence, symmetry and transitivity in minimally verbal children? And you know, sort of to kind of get at that, I just want to highlight Anne's performance if this is from the original article, the one that I just showed you the graphs from. But look, 350, this represents 350 trials for Anne to get the first set of words, right? And we're talking about 5 words here. We're not talking about hundreds. 5 words, 350 trials. But once she got it, her performance equals the performance of the other 2, right? Which is huge. right? It's huge. And I think part of what happened was we were in a preschool, the SLP said, no, I'm going to keep going. And we had this opportunity to do this research without anybody saying your funding is drying up or you have to stop now, or right. We just kept going to see what would happen. And that's what happened. So how did I do? Ooh, 7 minutes, not bad. So that's pretty much all I have. Oh, I do have a list of references for you if you would like them. But if you would like to contact me, you can find me at dmuldoon@albany.edu. And I guess I have time for questions at this point, right?
Yes, I think you do. I don't think I saw, so we've had some great comments in the chat, including if anyone missed it, someone did ask about accessing the recording so they can listen again. And please contact Nikia Dower for that. She put her email in the chat, and I did a little further up as well. Otherwise, yeah, we can open it up for questions. We had a lot of compliments here. I think it's pretty cool study you shared with us.
Hi, Lena. Especially, but Heather said, but the mediating response is possible if we tell the kids the name of the squiggle, right? Yes. Yes, it is.
I have a question.
Go for it.
This is really promising for those kids that are minimally vocal, but it's just a question with regards to whether any echoic repertoire was evident before, was established before the study. I mean, it doesn't have to be that they can imitate the entire word to completion, but was there an echoic repertoire established?
Andrew had an echoic repertoire. Anne and Nicole did not. I mean, Nicole was one of those classic autism kiddos, you know, a lot of stimming, a lot of squealing, a lot of screaming, and very, very little instructional time to be had with her. But and Anne was just one of those really low functioning little people who just kind of came in and sat and smiled and didn't do much of anything. So Andrew did have an echoic repertoire, but the children were very young too, Lena, like they were still 3. So not much had been established prior to us getting them, and it was COVID, so there was no EI service. There was nobody establishing anything with these kids before we got our hands on them.
Yeah, because, you know, it's something to, so we talk about relational frame theory, we talk about stimulus equivalence, and we look at the process, and we talk about generative language. That's all beautiful, and that's what we want. What I always question and wonder is the mode of operation, which is the process by which to achieve all of those things. What are the underlying mechanisms or responses that the person is engaging in, possibly covertly, that might mediate that process of responding with symmetry and transitivity? And I would argue that we all do this very intuitively, instinctively. We don't think about it, but if we were to analyze it, I would argue that there is some sort of a covert verbal behavior being done, repeated by the child. And that's my response, my question about the echoic response, because there's possibly an echoic, possible covert echoic rehearsal happening as the child is engaging in any process to get to the outcome. So it's interesting that, you know, the question becomes, is it a question of minimal vocal verbal ability versus enough versus lack of versus presentation opportunities for that echoic response to happen? But something is happening in between. And I think it's an important question to have, because those are those teachable moments. This is what tells us what the process of operation, you know, what is happening.
I mean,
mediate.
I guess a couple of things, I'm thinking about a couple of things as I'm listening. One of them is that you know, earlier or last year, you may have seen that there was a specific grant released for folks who were working with people who had significant cognitive and language impairment, because those kids are systematically excluded from research studies. And I feel like one of the answers to your question or to your comment is in that comment, right? If we never include those kids, how do we know? How do we know? We have nothing to work with. We have no reports of covert behavior. We have no, right? Right? We're between a rock and a hard place.
That was one of the questions that I had too, Deirdre, as we were looking at this, because this is something that I've been noticing in my minimally vocal kids for years, is the ones that did develop bidirectional naming were usually the kids that I taught to sign. And it was, and then I'm wondering also, like Lilith and I recently did a study, and so we were looking at, these are kids that I had taught to sign first, and then they moved to an SGD. But when they moved to the SGD, in the videos, as we're editing them for a presentation, like over and over again, I see like even when they're matching, Lilith is saying, you know, find this one, find the one I'm holding. And he signs, it's a spoon, he signs eat, then he mimes eating, then he finds it on the, you know, on the screen. And this happened not once, but like many times, even as they're doing like 3-word combinations. And so I was chatting privately with people all during this presentation, like, do you have SGD users who are developing stimulus equivalence? Do you have SGD users who like get, you know, acquire bidirectional naming? Are they saying something? Are they doing something? Yeah. Because it's the same as Lena's talking about. What is the mediating response? What is our conceptual analysis of how it develops? Is it, you know, and is it the lack of the repertoire in those, you know, these kids that we all, I'm share your love of these lower functioning kids, but also like a lot of those kids, social stimuli don't function as SDs and reinforcers. They're not paying attention. Like it's not attention worthy, the exposure that they have to language in natural settings. So when we're teaching them with 350 trials, these might be the first 350 trials that they paid attention, right. You know, right. So that they had a chance to come under control of the stimuli, right? Yeah. So then it is maybe not a big number at all, but a number that like it gives us joy, like hope for the future for kids, right? Because we can like modify 2 variables, maybe increase the value of social stimuli, and then also recognize we might have to have many training trials for these kids under these conditions. So to me, your research is very hopeful, very like exciting, and like and just gives me hope for the families where we have gone 500 trials trying to teach them, you know, because I felt they had all the prerequisite skills, and I'm like, well, why is it not working? Let's continue. Is this double the rate of their acquisition of some other, you know, relevant skill? Like trying to like look at rate of acquisition. Yeah. And that's the other thing is like when we look at kids like this, can we have a measure of their rate of learning of in some other area so that we don't give up? Because I think that's the other thing that happens, like you're saying. These kids drop out of studies because we're finished with the study and they're still on thing one.
Right. Or they're not included in the first place. And I think that's what I was saying to Lena, right? They're systematically kind of, oh, that kid will never learn this. We only have 6 months. Let's not do it. Right.
Yes.
But yeah.
Well, I love your research. Thank you for sharing this. Really compelling, really neat.
Let's hope we keep getting similar results, right? The second one, we got similar results. The third one, we're doing the expressive probes, so I'll let you know.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Any other questions?
I just jump in that if you do want to CEU, please make sure that there's some feedback. If you've already left feedback, I've recorded it, but if you have not and you think you may want to CEU for tonight's presentation, please just either add it to the chat or you are welcome to email it to me, and I'm going to one more time add my email to the chat.
I will do that, Nikia. I see your comment about Fernald. I will do that.
Thank you so much, Deirdre.
You're
This,
welcome.
and
It's a
I'm sorry,
pleasure.
I missed, has this been published yet?
Yes, this one is published in AJSLP, actually.
Lovely, great. Well,
Yeah.
I will definitely be looking at it to review
And
further.
the second one we submitted to autism and developmental language impairment. And for the third one, I'm going for JADD. Keep your fingers crossed for that one, right?
Well.